You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 260 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I want to start by talking about the legalization of recreational marijuana in Canada. I know the war on drugs doesn't typically fall into the foreign policy category and most people view it as domestic policy, but I think drug legalization and the ending of the criminalization and prohibition against substances will have big impacts not only on American foreign policy, because there's certainly a lot of U.S. foreign policy initiatives that are based in fighting a war on drugs, not only in the United States, but pressuring countries around the world to do so. And of course, in the past on the show, I've talked about the DEA involvement in the Central and South America. But I think in a lot of countries, even more so than the United States, the war on drugs has massive impacts on what's going on there. And then it affects how the U.S. reacts to these countries in other ways. So I do think it's pretty critical to foreign policy, even though it doesn't always seem like a foreign policy based issue. To share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or just head over to the Libertarian Institute, and there you can not only find this podcast, but also my daily news roundup, which, I put together anywhere usually between like 10 and 15 news stories that I think are important. I try to summarize them in a sentence or two and then provide the link for those of you who want to read more. And that's at, libertarianinstitute.org. All right. So a while ago, Canada announced that they were going to legalize all marijuana, and then that has finally gone into effect. Now, I'm not a fan of marijuana legalization because I think everybody should go out and use marijuana, or I necessarily think that marijuana is a good thing. I don't know if it improves the cultural fabric of the society if more people are smoking weed or not. I do think it's more harmful to outlaw the drug and punish people and try to force people not to use it than to just kind of let this the people who want to use marijuana use marijuana. And I also don't think that everybody getting high is somehow going to lead to a massive hippie anti-war movement, but it would be interesting if that starts to happen. But to get into this more seriously, I think looking at the effects of prohibition, people typically make the argument, especially for marijuana, that, liquor, beer, alcohol is more dangerous and tobacco is more dangerous. Those are both legal. So marijuana, either should be as well, or, you even have I think the more cynical people in the more kind of nanny staters, say, well, we should outlaw cigarettes and only allow, marijuana. I think that, this is kind of the worst surface level argument. I think the more important argument to make is just against prohibition in general. I think the lesson should easily be learned from Americans' prohibition of alcohol during, I think 20s and 30s. This policy is really in place where, we decide that we're going to outlaw alcohol. Now, this didn't result in nobody drinking alcohol, which of course has negative effects on society. It made some people more violent. You certainly have, people die, even now in drunk driving accidents and stuff like this. It makes people belligerent. It sometimes makes them, foolish choices. It also allows a lot of people to relax and have a good time. And, I'm sure that's necessary for some people to go about their lives and be happy, is to have that ability to take the edge off every once in a while and relax. But the fact is that people want to use alcohol whether it's legal or not. And so what's created then? Well, alcohol is turned into a black market. I think it's kind of lost. And I think the most important point here should be what is a black market? Well, it's a black market that can't use the government justice system because it's illegal, right? So if you're in a black market and, somebody promises to pay you X amount of dollars on X day and they don't pay you, you can't go to court and sue them, even if they have the money. So what are you left with? Your options are is to use force to take it from them or, not get that money. So it creates a lot of, dishonesty and corruption within the system, and also breeds a lot of violence because that's the only way to really, seek justice for when you're wrong is by going out and using violence. And of course, I think it's also a situation where it kind of pulls all the worst kind of characters in because, if violence rules the day, then, the violent people will be the rulers of these cartels. And that's, something we've seen time and time again that, even when the government arrests one of these guys, the next guy is always like 3 times as brutal as the guy before. And so, the people who get brought in are absolutely terrible. But when you look at the war on drugs in the United States, and I think one of the reasons we see this as more of a domestic issue is because it has some impact, there is more violence in the inner city specifically and, in other areas around the United States where there's a, heavy amount of drug trafficking, the fact that people can't go to the authorities or, use kind of the public established, means of seeking justice because their business has been driven underground, they result to violence. So this, I think, becomes a bigger issue when you look at countries with smaller and smaller economies. If you look at Mexico and the, influence that the cartels have in that country. I mean, I have Brian Sadie on the show a couple times now, to discuss all the cartels, bribing the politicians, killing the politicians. I think it was 80 or so, politicians that were killed in the most recent Mexican, election cycle, many of which were claimed by the cartels. There's no doubt there's heavy links between the cartels and the Mexican, government and even the Mexican media. They pay off to run certain stories or not cover certain murders or whatever else. And the reason that the cartels are able to do that, in Mexico versus the United States, even though the United States, I think, are, some of the biggest consumers of the illegal drugs, and I think actually, you consume drugs at higher rates than Mexicans, is that, we have all these other industries that are so much bigger than the drug industry that buy off, our government, including the, legal drug, the pharmaceutical industry, the weapons industry. Silicon Valley's big on the racket now, the banks, and the financial institutions. And so I guess maybe there is a little bit of a benefit for like kind of the civilian population of the country to have, the people who are bribing your officials not be people from necessarily the black market like the drug market, but, to be of, kind of these more, I mean, they still do illegal things like, the big banks and the weapons makers sell to Saudi Arabia and they use those weapons to slaughter civilians, but it's all above board and they could, seek redresses for their grievances in court. So, if you move south of Mexico and start to look at Honduras and El Salvador and the Central American countries like Nicaragua, they see a lot more instability than the United States and, see a lot of violence to the point where you have people, legitimate refugees of the U.S. drug war, then moving north and seeking refuge in the United States because, here we have a working criminal justice system. And, in some cases, it's, pretty much because, the cartels have bought off their home, government. I think this is, one of the worst parts, to me about the policy, especially from the American side, is that, we have this drug appetite that, and so much wealth that we're able to pay huge sums of money, to get ourselves high. And yet we want to pretend like we don't have a drug problem. And so then we, outlaw these drugs and we force, the Mexican government and all these other governments, to run counter narcotics operations. And, we give them financial incentives, to target their cartels. And we certainly send our own DEA agents and others down to their, countries to, help them fight the war on drugs and train up, we've trained up a Honduras police force, different Mexican police forces, and paramilitaries in other countries, hoping at times that they would target the cartels. Certainly there's, now a lot of support from the right-wing government in Colombia. And, that a lot of this is to help them fight the war on cocaine down there. And so we're really facilitating violence in all these countries. So we could kind of go on this moral crusade and pretend that the problem isn't that, the people, up north, the Americans just, they want to get high. And so now you have problems like, these migrants starting to come into America and what to do. Of course, the Republican solution and the Trump solution specifically is to build a wall, which again, I don't really think that, the government taking these actions to try to prohibit things, whether it's, drug use or even illegal immigration will necessarily work. I think, people will find a way into the country to illegally immigrate either way. And, I think the solution is just more legal immigration than anything else. But not to, go down that path too much. but, to really highlight now that Trump is like getting himself in all these like international crises when, the solution for him could be all very simple. And that is to, just legalize drugs and allow, people in Honduras and other places, legally get rich, bringing those drugs, from South America to the United States rather than, getting poor and being suppressed. Why, violent cartel and gang members buy off their government officials and just steal all the wealth and, let them run rampant in those countries. So I generally think this trend towards legalization of marijuana is absolutely fantastic. And I'm hoping that, these initiatives have a lot of success and we start to see this be a more widely accepted position and we could start to see the legalization of marijuana and hopefully one day other drugs as well. I mean, again, we can't overlook Afghanistan here. Absolutely, because the United States, in line with this moral crusade at home that we have to fight drugs, that means we have to fight drugs everywhere. And so now we're carrying out bombing missions in Afghanistan against people making opium and, producing opium for heroin when, these people could really just be out there, farming their poppy and then selling the, products to pharmaceutical companies. Or if there wasn't a war there, maybe they could grow some other crops as well. But, the high money from an illegal crop certainly, brings better wages and is a more immediate reward than planting fruit trees or something. Speaking of Afghanistan, I want to mention that I had talked on the show, I believe about a week ago, that Afghani political candidate in this upcoming election was killed in the Helmand province by a bombing. The Taliban have claimed a responsibility for that bombing. I thought that move, or that mission was interesting, just as I know the talks between the United States and the Taliban, one of the things that the United States was asking for was, a peace guarantee for this upcoming election. And by claiming responsibility, that seems to go in the face of that peace guarantee. I don't want to pretend like though that the same Taliban members and the same factions of the Taliban that sat down with, U.S. peace envoy to Afghanistan, Zalime Khalilzad, was lying to his face or, heard this from him, then went home and decided to kill an Afghan politician and claim responsibility for it. The Taliban may be much more fractured than that. Some North and South Korea news. I think if you're looking at, if the world was just the bubble around the Korean peninsula, I think you would be looking at amazing strides happening here. But there's a Moon of Alabama article that I'll link to in the show notes page that really highlights how the United States is slowing down the peace process there. We have this admission, I think finally by the New York Times, that the Singapore summit signed agreement was meant to be a numerical order. So 1, 2, 3, 4 step plan and not just 4 things that the United States generally wants to have. The United States and North Korea agree they generally want to have happen. And so this means that points 1 and 2, which are, building peace and trust measures and reducing North Korea's need for a nuclear deterrent, would eventually lead to point 3, which is North Korea starting to give up their nuclear weapons. However, even though Trump signed this agreement, I'm not sure if it's, clear policy, at least to the members of the Trump administration that are, kind of setting action and advising Trump, that this is the order that things should be in, and that it still seems from the United States, they're looking for unilateral North Korean denuclearization prior to the United States giving them any kind of relief or peace guarantees. I think, this is probably a non-starter and a poison pill for any talks and any progress to be made, just because you can't expect one side to give up everything before you give up anything. I think there's, some people within the United States who would probably claim, well, we're morally superior to everyone else, and, you could trust our ward. But even the North Koreans don't see this as true. I've often talked about in the past on the show about how under the Bush administration, and I think largely spearheaded by John Bolton, who's now National Security Advisor, the agreement with the Clinton administration and the then Kim leader of North Korea was in place and working to make sure that North Korea didn't get nuclear weapons, but the United States lied about it and pushed North Korea out of the agreement. And so, with these legitimate concerns from the North Korean government, to see some concessions made by the United States before denuclearization and, some meeting in the middle going on we could really be in trouble here. Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, was speaking to a French paper and, said, look, the North Koreans are taking steps here. They've destroyed a missile facility. They destroyed their nuclear testing facility. We're working on demining the DMZ. North Korea has returned the remains of Americans killed in the the Korean War. You've had several very meaningful summits and meetings between the leaders of North and South Korea. Seeing reporting from people who have visited North Korea, some of the anti-American propaganda has been removed from the capital city and replaced with still propaganda, but more economic-based propaganda. And at this point, it's time to give North Korea, and I think, he's kind of just saying throw him a bone. I think declaring an end to the Korean War would be a big deal for the North Koreans. And so that's an option, or some sanctions relief. However, the United States is talking about putting stricter sanctions on North Korea when you have countries like South Korea, like Russia, like China, less so South Korea than the other two, kind of saying hey, look at the progress being made here. Let's talk about some sanctions relief for North Korea. It's always important to remember that the people harmed most by the sanctions are the people of North Korea, those the United States claims are slaves that we have to liberate. Something that, I had read about in the past that was being floated was reopening the rails and the roads between North and South Korea. However, some problems here lie in the U.S. sanctions. And so again, this could be a place where we see U.S. sanctions and U.S. policy slowing the Korean peace process by preventing these rails and roads from being open. I mean, imagine a world here where you have people on a Sunday drive going across what was once a, mined and most heavily armed and monitored and weaponized border in the entire world. And, they're just going to visit some relatives on the other side now. These kind of things are not impossible to see happen as long as we allow the Korean people to continue to, achieve the peace they desire. Again, it's hard to know, how popular this is in North Korea or what even information they're getting about it. But in South Korea, this is, I think, popular by about 2/3 of the country, and the party of the most hawkishness towards North Korea is getting weaker and weaker, only representing about 20%. The Khashoggi saga continues, and we still don't have any answers, including an admission or a body or anything like that of what happened to this guy. CNN had reported, and it was widely reported outside of CNN as well. I think CNN had the first report there, that the Saudis were prepared to admit that Khashoggi died under interrogation and that it was rogue actors of the state. Turkey has presented evidence that a couple of the guys that are alleged part of the 15-member assassination team that killed Khashoggi were, bodyguards and close loyalists of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And so this would certainly implicate him, if his guys are doing this. However, we have to remember that all this evidence is coming out through the filter of the Turkish government, which has its own problems with Saudi Arabia and certainly problems with honesty. So I just want to make the point that it's not impossible, that it was, somewhat rogue members of the Saudi royal family, who Mohammed bin Salman had rounded up a lot of his uncles and cousins. And so some of them might be pretty angry at him about all that and want to do something about it. And so, I guess it's possible that, one of them did it in an attempt to really hurt the prince's standing in the West. However, this guy, Mohammed bin Salman, has proved to be, a wrecking ball. If you look at the policy with Qatar or in Yemen, both of them have been absolutely disastrous and almost inexplicably so. That you had to wonder, what's wrong with this guy that he continues this policy that's continuing to fail. And so, I still see this one going anyway. I'm definitely not going to make an official prediction. Eventually, I will, go through once we have all the, information that we're going to get about the situation and try to break it down as to exactly what happened here and why. The last thing I'll note is that the Turks say they investigated the consulate. They didn't find any, physical evidence of murder, but some circumstantial evidence like some toxic materials as they describe them, and then the recent repainting of an area of the consulate. Syria. We have Erdogan mentioning that he's looking at deploying more Turkish troops to northeastern Syria, and that would be to combat the Kurds. Recently, Turkey has been complaining that America hasn't held up their end of the agreement for the city of Manbij, which is a city in northern Syria that is actually west of the Euphrates River, once held by the Syrian Kurds, but in an agreement between the United States and Turkey, the Kurdish armed forces were supposed to leave that city, and then it was supposed to be jointly patrolled by Turkish forces and American forces. However, Turkey's complained that that deal hasn't been followed through on by the Americans. All the Americans have reported it has been. It looks like the ceasefire in the Idlib province continues to hold. I saw a report, I think on Voice of America, saying that the rebels are, I guess, have removed their heavy weaponry from the buffer zone, but have not removed all the jihadists yet from that area, but it looks like they're continuing to leave. And about 300 white helmets who are now in Jordan will be resettled in Western countries. I believe Britain and Canada were two of those listed. I think it's important to remember that the white helmets were really tied and worked with the Al-Qaeda rebels in Syria. And so I'm guessing that, if this was 300 members of the Syrian army that was coming to the United States, people would be out there complaining about being too nice to Assad. But here, you're really not going to see that. And, not that these guys are maybe jihadists themselves or, the people that are going to go out and do a bombing. And they could all be completely innocent people, well vetted. And the members of the White Helmet that were really there to dig people out from under the rubble and not create propaganda and, carry out executions like some members of the White Helmet did. But even then, they could be used as contacts, for different Al-Qaeda members in these Western countries and very dangerous. But I don't want to, take the whole Trumpian view that we shouldn't have people coming to the United States or anything like that. Some stories in Africa that I want to cover real quick. South Sudan, we have a report from the UN that the South Sudanese government is responsible for about 80% of child killings throughout the civil war, and then 90% of child rapes. And so absolutely disturbing stuff here. Of course, this is kind of the situation that the Obama government alongside, Hillary Clinton being the driving secretary of state, they're splitting the state into two and setting this absolute monster as the leader of South Sudan. I think he'll continue to be the leader and his party will continue to rule, even though they've just carried out atrocity after atrocity there. Libya continues to be a mess. There's a lot of instability in Tripoli right now. They have to keep closing the airport because rebels are firing artillery at it. I read that Haftar, who is the field marshal in charge of the eastern half of Libya, is raising additional army brigades. And so, people have talked about him possibly turning his attention west and looking to conquer all of Libya. I don't know if that would, be the wisest move for him. Maybe he should just be happy controlling the half of Libya that he controls. But that country just continues to be an absolute fire since the U.S. intervention there in 2011, where you have slavery, you have this giant migrant crisis where, every month, maybe not every month anymore, but certainly every couple months, you have a sinking of one of these refugee ships or the capsizing, and 100 people or so die. They're tragedies and every single time. Another interesting note about Haftar is just that, this is a guy whose army is guilty of definitely some war crimes, and he likely is himself, and yet he was able to seek medical treatment in France pretty recently, and he's an older gentleman, and so if he does end up conquering all of Libya, we could be looking in a lot of trouble, just because he's probably not going to live forever. Somalia, the United States has claimed a couple times in recent weeks to kill a good number of Somali troops. This most recent time it was, Al-Shabaab troops, who are the rebellion group in South Somalia who has pledged alliance with Al-Qaeda. My skepticism here is the only proof ever given is often from the Defense Department saying that we killed all these guys. And man, it seems to me it could just be as easy as killing some civilians and claiming that they're Al-Shabaab. We also recently had the anniversary that, almost completely went unnoticed, and the terror attack itself almost did, which was the truck bombing in Mogadishu of October of last year, in which over 600 people died. It was the biggest terror attack since 9/11, the biggest terror attack in the history of Africa, and I believe about the third most casualties all time. And, there's strong evidence that there's U.S. soldiers involved in the massacre that possibly provoked that terror attack. And, U.S. Atrocities to Somalia are not unheard of. And, there's real implications to them, including, the possibility of this truck bombing being one of them. In the Congo, we have a UN worker. I think the guy was a plumber, came down with Ebola. And so, I just want to emphasize, like, this continues to be a problem in the Congo. There's warring factions there, and it seems like that could really all fall apart at any time. And then a little bit of good news to end on, as a Nigerian militia let about 833 children release them. Some of them, I think, were maybe more like sexual property being traded, and then some young children also being in their armed forces. And so hopefully these, kids could get in aid groups and get the treatment they need to, go on and live much better lives than they would have had they not been released. And so, hopefully that's a little bit of good news after all that depressing stuff to end on the Friday here. I hope you all are enjoying the show. I hope you really take the time to share it. It's very important for the show to grow, for people to go out there and recommend it and tell people, hey, I really like this. I think there's important information here. So please go out and do that. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, Facebook, check out Libertarian Union, Twitter at KYAAALE. And then if you really like the show and want to give me some financial support that I would very much appreciate, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.